Autonomous car safety, it's in the news all the time. Well, we're here with Oliver Cameron of Voyage, and you guys are leading an industry initiative to tackle that very problem. Why don't you give us an overview of what you're doing?
So the Open Autonomous Safety Initiative is designed to be a safety program for companies in our space, self-driving cars, to adopt. What that means is that we've open sourced our safety materials, our processes, even some test code to enable an autonomous vehicle company, which tests every single day, multi-ton vehicles out in the real world, a safety program that they can adopt to implement at their company.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey down this autonomous road and how it led to that?
So our mission here at Voyage is to serve communities with autonomous vehicles. What we see is that in communities around the country, vehicles provide a whole bunch of different services for communities. And what we do is we hope to enable those services to become better, safer, more affordable by powering them with autonomous vehicles. Our first community is a retirement community, or more rather a retirement city in Florida. It's 160,000 people, 750 miles of road, and what we offer there today is a door-to-door taxi service. We're expanding to more locations within that region, offering more services and serving that community with autonomous vehicles. Typically, an autonomous vehicle company, might be started by software engineers, right? Roboticists, machine learning folks, etc. What we discovered is that operations, how you test an autonomous vehicle, is an intricate discipline unto itself. And the skill sets that you find in typical, software engineers maybe don't lend themselves all too well to how you stress test a 2.5-ton vehicle. So what we did is we, did what we knew how, and we hired some world-class folks that were in this field in operations of autonomous vehicles, and we, tasked them with building our own internal kind of safety program. What we discovered is that safety program was awesome, and that we see a whole bunch of startups around the world defining their own safety programs, which we think is dangerous. And a safety program has a lot of amazing potential to be standardized. We think that standardization in this field enables safety. So what we did is we decided to take all that internal, all those processes, those materials, assets, the test code, all that sort of stuff, get it ready for public consumption, and open source today small part of that. But we're open sourcing tons continuously.
We're with Eric Gonzalez. Eric is one of the co-founders of Voyage, as well as the guy who's really leading this initiative. There's 4 elements in this initiative today. Why don't you give us an overview of what those are?
This has been what we've learned throughout the past year and a half, roughly, of us building autonomous vehicles. So one of the things that we try to validate is how do we make sure that the vehicles are safe when operating in the public. And so the collection of the 4 items is our initial release for our approach to safety. So scenario testing. Scenario testing involves how we start to assess common situations and situations that would stress the vehicle, and then making sure that they can react appropriately. So we do that both in the real world and in simulation to validate that our systems work as intended. And then we also go into aspects of functional safety. So this very much is just an introduction into the process. But when you think about designing these various complex systems, how do you make sure that they're safe? How do you make sure they're robust against certain failures? How do you make sure that when a failure happens, that you have expected recovery scenarios for those as well? The other thing that I think the industry doesn't really have much of a standard on is how you assess performance of vehicles. So the DMV has some guidelines around disengagements, but people classify disengagements differently. Some might say this is a critical disengagement. Some might say that's just a normal driver intervention. And so we wanted to start to think of, as everyone's moving towards a level 4 vehicle without a driver, how do we start to think about assessing these vehicles? Because the way that you assess them isn't always relying on a human in the driver's seat. And then the last part is more of our what we're calling testing toolkit. So testing toolkit right now is how we start to build out these scenarios. But eventually you'll start to cover some of the code that we use to also validate the systems.
This is just a start, and it sounds like there are going to be other things. And one of the things that pops into mind is cybersecurity being one of the challenges, right?
Yes, very much so. So when you start to think about building these systems, most of them have connections to the internet. Most of these rely on very complex kind of interactions between systems. And so there is this notion of there might be a bad actor. How do you prevent that? And so there's work that the open source community is doing, the work that we're doing to try to build and make our systems more robust. One example is when you think about effectively access control policies. So if I design a module that I know specifically who it's communicating with and how often, And when you think about other, like, suppose a bad actor was to get in the system, you can start to think about methods of doing encryption at the systems level too. And then you can go even further so far of thinking about, very similar to have you have an application like an iPhone, the apps are signed. You could have the same thing for an autonomous vehicle, that you know the code that runs on the car is valid.
One of the things that struck me when you're talking about the assessment thing, that there won't always be operators. So does that start to get the passenger involved, for instance?
So ideally, you're doing an assessment that doesn't require a passenger, because you'll have cases in which your vehicle has been summoned and no one's in the car, so you can't rely on having a passenger at all. Many of these trips, if you can imagine, once you have an autonomous vehicle, they may not be only transporting people. It might be transporting goods and other services. So when you design the systems, we have to assume that a human is not present.
But I would imagine that could be some of the scenario testing, though, where passengers' feedback becomes critical, right?
Yeah, so it's really interesting to see how passengers react to systems. Like, you can imagine having a vehicle pull up to pick you up and open the doors without a driver is going to be a very kind of interesting interaction. And so, it's something to account for, of how effectively a passenger can flag when they, in an emergency situation, or in very common situations. Like, you might be driving to the clubhouse and you see someone you want to talk to, you may want to just get out and have the car pull over.
Yeah, it's that human factor stuff, I guess, becomes challenging in general, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can also think about how when you start to pick up like passengers, where you pick them up, how they flag you down, like you have that luxury of having a human to help with those like last few feet. But in an autonomous vehicle, it becomes certainly more complex to parse a human's gestures.
I noticed that it's on GitHub. It's an open source type project. What does one have to do to become involved with it?
If you look at the open source communities and examples of open source, there very much is a great structure for one is how you collaborate, how you have debate, how you request information. So where's an area that needs attention and where I could invite contributions. All those tools have been built out for open source for years, and GitHub is a great place to do that. So that's why we're hosting on GitHub.
You mentioned the DMV, I believe. It seems like there's an opportunity there for regulatory agencies to become involved in this.
Correct. Yeah. So when we think about, you're mentioning the DMV and kind of the reporting, they've gone further this year to ask companies to further clarify when they talk about disengagements, when they talk about systems, to provide information. The DMV also does a great job of when you build an autonomous vehicle, you want it to operate on a road without a passenger, completely driverless, that they have to do a review of your individual systems. But of course, that can only go so far. Like you're describing still at a very high level. So as much as you can do to be transparent and kind of open and standardized, I think that would benefit everyone in the industry.
Well, and that's what I noticed was just trying to get the information from an outsider's viewpoint. It wasn't like there was a centralized database where it was easy to go in and do a search or something.
Yeah, I mean, very much most of it's self-reported. You have to, you get to pick what you classify as disengagement. Some people take certain liberties with that. So yeah, I think having some more standard ways, being able to describe the nuances of a disengagement, I think makes sense.
From a scenario perspective, it looks like you're starting to play back data as well in some of the hypothetical driving scenarios. Is that what the simulations kind of do?
Yeah, so when you think about these vehicles, they collect gigabytes of data per minute, and we make heavy use of that data. And so when we work toward building our systems and improving them, simulation is heavily involved. The scenarios are kind of the first start, and then we can further go back and simulate a scenario. We can further go back and simulate improvements that we'd see. So as the year progresses, we're hoping we can open source more and more of our simulation structure, how we use simulation, and kind of hopefully benefit everyone.
That would seem like it'd be huge, because then suddenly the industry can start to learn from each other.
Yeah, I think even learning from the individual scenarios is large. So if I have details about what I consider assessments of quality, so you could just say like, sure, a vehicle got from point A to point B, but that's not detailed enough. Like, did it give appropriate right-of-way in situations? Was the ride comfortable? Like all these things that you start to assess in terms of quality, you can express in those scenario formats.
Well, and you just mentioned, was the ride comfortable? That was, I think, kind of where I was going to with the passenger input, right? Because it seems like that has to come from the passenger, doesn't it?
Yeah, and so that's something we make use of now with our customers in the villages in San Jose, is that at the end of the ride, they're asked to assess the performance of the vehicle and asked if they, for some reason, think the ride experience was poor, we follow up with additional questions. So it's something that factors into our development.
Makes a lot of sense. And there's also 7 key performance metrics. Again, do you see this playing back into how it works with, say, DMV or others?
Yeah, we're hoping that people start to adopt kind of these proposals that propose other ways that they internally assess their vehicles. This just happens to be our proposal. But it would be great to learn more about kind of how other people think of assessing quality. We have extensions that we really want to get to soon that we can also share. But yeah, we think this is a great start. When you look at many autonomous vehicle kind of manufacturers, they're all using some level of like teleoperations, and the way they assess those systems is important. So I think being more open about that is very useful.
That makes sense. It'd be interesting to understand things like the connectivity needs between the autonomous vehicles and the rest of the world.
Yeah, no, that's very, you'll see very much 5G wireless networks being presented in this context of their nearly gigabit speeds and how they can be useful to very complex and autonomous vehicles.
And that would kind of beg the question. It seems like telecommunications companies, even entertainment companies should probably be involved in this effort, right?
Yeah, you'll see people who are developing wireless technologies in the space are suddenly seeing like how they can apply that to autonomous vehicles as well.
What about collusion, antitrust? Are there issues around that for this kind of initiative?
I don't believe so. I think if you look at other open source projects, there's very much instances where you'll see Facebook starting a project that competitors contribute to. And it's true of Google projects, it's true of any project. So you could take Android, for instance, right? Like many people contribute to Android, even though they might be a competitor to that. So I don't see that at this point.
Do you see this eventually being kind of lifted off Voyage's plate and becoming an open source project on its own?
Yeah, no, I think we ideally would like to see it grow to that point where we have enough collaborators that it's not specifically a Voyage kind of project, that we have content sourced from many different providers.
So tell me, what's happened since the announcement? Have the expectations, your expectations been met?
Oh, for sure. So the announcement was amazing. We had tons of traffic to the repo, to the site itself, just lots of very interested people. I think the current climate around autonomous vehicles meant that this announcement was particularly timely. We heard from a whole bunch of folks in industry as well, not just companies, but people that work at other companies in this space, saying that this was a good idea and that the industry needs something like this. We heard a few questions about, hey, like, shouldn't this be an internal secret, intellectual property and such? And in our opinion, no, it should be something that's out there, that's doing good for the world. Since the announcement, we just have had a ton of interest in what we're doing, a ton of want to also participate, and we can't wait to have all these different contributions from all these companies from around the world contribute to build the standard in autonomous safety. And we think that can be the OAS.